Faiza Mahamud is a graduate of the Humphrey School's Master of Public Affairs program and a journalist at the Star Tribune, part of the Pulitzer Prize Award winning team, covering events in the Twin Cities. Prior to graduating from the Humphrey School, she also graduated from Augsburg University, right next door to us, and with whom we often cooperate. And before working at the Star Tribune, she was a reporter and editor at the largest African community newspaper in Minnesota. Faiza is going to be interviewing Thandiwe Matthews, who also was at the Humphrey School as part of the Humphrey International Fellows program during 2015-16. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'll turn it over to Faiza. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for the warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you all this morning and just excited to be having this conversation with my sister, Thandiwe Matthews, who's currently at the Hague in the Netherlands. But before I introduce Thandiwe, I would love to talk about some of the issues that brings us together. Like we all know, Minneapolis now has become that epicenter for America's long struggle for racial injustice and inequality. In the spring of 2020, George Floyd was murdered in broad daylight by a Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin. Floyd's chilling encounter was filmed and posted on Facebook by Darnella Frazier, who was a teenager then. We're all expecting Chauvin's sentence today at 1:30 p.m. It was Floyd's killing, I believe, and the pandemic that raised not just local awareness, but global awareness, shining light on the racial inequality and injustice that exists in every part of America. To understand America, I believe we must recognize its dark history. We must be grateful to the owners of this land, the indigenous people who, despite the difficulties and horror they endured, all they wanted was to establish peace, friendship, and preserve their homelands, their tribal homelands. The enslaved Blacks and the immigrants who played a huge role in making this country successful and who paved the way for us to even be products of this wonderful institution, the Humphrey School. Like we all want that dignified life, right? And a peaceful life and a home that not only celebrates our similarities, but also our differences. That's why we're here today, to have these difficult conversations so that we can be fair and effective leaders for our communities, either here in the United States or abroad. With that said, I would love to introduce Thandiwe. Thandiwe Matthews is a South African human rights lawyer who's currently in The Hague doing her PhD in human rights and inequality at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Her research explores the role of constitutionally protected human rights to address structural inequalities of gender, race, class, and age in post-1994 South Africa, with a specific focus on social protection. Matthews' academic work has been published in a number of local and international journals, including the Oxford Journal of Human Rights Practice, the South African Journal on Human Rights and Development, South Africa. She's an alumna of the U.S. State Department's Fulbright Humphrey Fellowship Program from 2015 to 2016, based at the University of Minnesota's Law School, where she researched global human rights monitoring methods to reduce socioeconomic inequalities. In 2018, Thandiwe Matthews co-authored and published a bilingual children's book in English and Zulu titled her story, Daughters of Majanji, focusing on 30 South African women across generations and from different sectors and spheres of life, linked around themes of affirmation, identity, gender, and mental health. Thandiwe has spent her whole career looking at issues South Africa faced during the apartheid. She and I will be talking about her perspective of women in the global South on issues around peace building and the events here in Minnesota. Welcome, Thandi. We're so grateful to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Faiza.
Absolutely. Did you have anything to say, or should we just go ahead with the questions?
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you also to the Humphrey School. It's always great to be back. I graduated from the Humphrey program 5 years ago. And so to see some nice familiar faces on the screen like Masood has been also nice to see. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Well, let's get started. If any of you have questions, please put it in the chat box and one of us will be monitoring that. Hopefully we're gonna have some time at the end to do Q&A. Thandi, let's just tell the audience here a little bit background about ourselves. I was born in Somalia and raised in Kenya. My family fled Somalia when the war broke. So I spent a good chunk, almost half of my life in Kenya. Most of it was spent in refugee camps. So I want people to have a little bit background about who we are. Thandi's obviously a South African. Like I mentioned, she's in The Hague doing her PhD and she teaches most of her time and contributes her wonderful time doing these conversations. Thandi, let's begin just going back to Africa for a little bit. You're a human rights lawyer. Your Constitution is your baby. And as a journalist, we do defend our constitutional rights, freedom of speech. We're defenders of the First Amendment here. But the constitutions of Africa in some of the African countries and here in the United States is a bit different. Many African countries have changed their constitutions since white colonialism. South Africa, which was colonized by the Dutch and the British, adopted a new constitution, I believe in May 8, 1996. Kenya, where I grew up, also did adopt a new constitution in 2010, and I was there to witness it as a student journalist, which was fascinating. So we have talked about constitution being a foundation of peace building, particularly the South African constitution, which is considered to be the most advanced and held as a model for peace building. I wonder if there's something to be learned from South Africa's history in the struggle for democracy in the context of its new constitution. Obviously, we know not everything is perfect. There are some missing gaps in everything we have now. Coming out of that apartheid era, how does that impact justice? And can we learn something from South Africa? We all know Nelson Mandela, right?
Yeah, thank you, Faiza. I think something that's very unique and special about the South African Constitution is that in that moment of history, and we must remember that when South Africa became a democracy, it was also at a very specific time in our global history. It was the end of the Cold War. And so there was a lot of hope for building a new kind of society. I think at the same time, the anti-apartheid movement was one that was very diverse. It was multicultural. It was diverse in religion, diverse in class and race background. And so what you see in the Constitution, and the reason why it's something that's very personal for me is also because I come from a family of activists. My parents were very actively involved in the social movement called the United Democratic Front. And what made the United Democratic Front very, I think, unique at the time was that it was able to encapture a social move, well, to encapture all the diverse aspects of the anti-apartheid struggle and all the different movements and put them under one umbrella so that you would have a collective effort to combat apartheid. And you see that very nicely reflected in the South African Constitution. The South African Constitution was the first in the world to recognize the right to a clean environment, to recognize women's sexual and reproductive health rights, to recognize also that freedom of expression should be limited by notions of hate speech. It was also one of the first constitutions that explicitly recognized the state's duty to promote equality. So not just non-discrimination, which is very common in constitutions across the world, including the United States, but that the state has a duty to promote the right to equality. Another thing that I thought was very important in the South African Constitution is that we also recognized all forms of gender identity. And that was already in 1996. And so that gives expression to how diverse the anti-apartheid movement was and how progressive it was, notwithstanding apartheid being a very harmful and degrading system. The other thing that I think is very important to recognize in the Constitution is that in the South African Constitution is that it explicitly recognizes the right to dignity and social justice. And perhaps that is where we can critique how we have interpreted how to proceed in our democracy going forward. South Africa is now one of the most unequal countries in the world, notwithstanding having this very progressive constitution that not only recognizes civil and political rights, so your rights to vote, your rights to freely associate and assemble, your rights to freedom of expression, but also socioeconomic rights, which are not only protected, they are also justiciable. It means that you can go to court and demand your right to housing or your right to education or your right to social security. These are very progressive ideas that I think the drafters of the Constitution had at the time. But at the same time, policy implementation has been very fragmented. And so what we now see is that notwithstanding having the Constitution, we also have a society that is very fragmented, not only along racial lines still, but also huge economic disparities. And so I think we do need to think about how do we operationalize social justice? And what does social justice mean to victims of violations? And who gets to determine what the outcome of justice should look like? I think it's been 26 years now since we've been a democracy. And so obviously there's a lot of room for critique. And while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the processes of transitional justice were hailed throughout the world as being very, not only progressive, but a step towards healing, because there were moments where we could have slipped into civil war, as was common at the time throughout our continent. We managed to kind of reconcile, but that came at a cost. We could do political transition in the absence of economic transition and promoting equity. And so now my generation is starting to feel the consequences of those decisions. I come from a very privileged background. I've been able to experience the benefits of democracy, but I also probably form part of the top 10% of my society, which means that the majority of my peers, and Faiza, we must remember, we come from a continent where 2/3 of the continent is under the age of 30. It means that, if we don't start thinking about how we address inequality and very deeply entrenched inequalities, we are going to get a continent that is going to be more and more angry. And I understand that frustration. So we do have these very progressive laws on the one hand, but what do laws mean if they are not felt in practice?
You bring up a good point. Actually, you did a wonderful way of getting to my next question. Here in Minnesota, a couple of years ago, before George Floyd was murdered, students, there've been nationwide walkouts led by students, mostly in the K-12 system, demanding stricter gun laws. Those in positions of power have mostly been in the shadows, not endorsing the protests, but also respecting students' freedom, students' rights to free speech. But recent events have been different. We've seen so many people join this effort, this fight for social justice and racial equity. Is the Constitution enough to achieve justice? Is the Constitution enough to protect people?
Well, I think constitutions are important. It does give you the foundation of the vision that you want for your society. But of course, it's not enough. I think you know, one of the criticisms that we have in South Africa at the moment is there hasn't been enough rights education and rights advocacy within our intergenerational process, right? So, of course, I'm very lucky because I've had parents who have spoken to me about struggle from the time I was little. But this is not something that is mainstreamed in schools. And I think it's very important that for constitutions to have a lived reality, that these are processes that need to happen in school. I mean, we know in the US, I'm not sure what the preamble is that you learn to recite when you're in kindergarten. But you're very much aware of the values of the Constitution. We don't have the same kind of process in South Africa. And so if you are not adequately educated about our history in very human terms from the outset, it becomes very difficult to convince people why you need to adhere to certain constitutional provisions, not just as laws, but as values of the kind of society we want to live in. I spent a lot of time working at the Human Rights Commission, and it was always very interesting because we got lots of complaints about various statements that were made on social media. And people would always say, well, we have the freedom of expression to say what we want. And yes, social media is an extremely important tool to promote freedom of expression. At the same time, we're also a society that is supposed to be embedded with values of dignity, with values of equality. And if we are going to allow certain statements to be made under the guise of freedom of expression, at the expense of the dignity of another person, not only a fellow citizen, but in the South African Constitution, reference is made to everyone being entitled to dignity. These are things that need to be, I think, inculcated within you from the time that you are a child, and not just about, well, the law says so. It needs to be, well, our society says so, and we want to live in a peaceful and just society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you know, as a journalist, I believe that freedom of expression comes with a lot of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And
Totally.
just because, you know, we have the power to publish things, we have to think about the harm we can cause in our society. And now we have, you know, social media where people can post whatever they need, not knowing the effects and the damages that can happen once, you know, you put something out there. So I hear you when you say freedom of expression comes with a lot of responsibility. You mentioned constitution. The constitution is not enough. Obviously, it hasn't been enough for many African countries, because when the constitutions were put together in some of the countries like Kenya, it was done with the help of the white colonialist, and it hasn't been enough. It hasn't been working for people who are natives for that country. And you see the benefits and the negatives of getting a new constitution. But I want to segue to your presence at the Humphrey School in 2015, 2016. You have always kept a close eye on issues happening in the Twin Cities. I'm curious to know how the events then and now, you know, with George Floyd's murder happening in Minneapolis, or Minnesota, around policing look to you, especially coming from South Africa? What's your take on what's happening here in Minnesota, and your how you've been looking at things when you were here?
Well, I mean, I think for everybody, witnessing that form of police brutality in broad daylight in one of the most progressive democracies in the world was just painful to see. It did spark a very big conversation in South Africa about, you know, the solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US context, while also not really being concerned about how Black bodies are being treated by the police in the South African context. Policing, I think, has become very brutal throughout the world, and particularly against Black people, and we see that in South Africa too. You know, we one of the few well, I don't think one of the few, but we are a country that really does exercise our constitutional rights, and especially the right to protest and the right to assembly. And every year, despite the number or despite the courts affirming that these rights are important and that the police has a responsibility to respect the right, often protesters who are poor and Black are met with severe forms of brutality from the police. With the most, I think, vivid recollection for me since leaving the Humphrey School and going back to South Africa was with the Fees Must Fall protest, which was students protesting for free higher education, and also protesting against sexual and gender-based violence that they were experiencing on campus. And it was, these protests started actually when I was at the Humphrey, when I was on the Humphrey program. And what was really beautiful at the beginning was that the protests started as very multicultural and multiracial protests. Young white students understood that the police would probably not treat them in the same way as they would their Black counterparts. And so what they did at the outset, and I think that was also reflected during the George Floyd protests, was that human chains, white allies created human chains around Black protesters to ensure that their Black colleagues were kept safe. What was also very profound at the time was that women were protesting naked to demonstrate to the police that, you know, were they going to be violated even if they were naked while protesting. But we also saw the police respond with tear gas, with rubber bullets towards unarmed students. And this created a conversation in South Africa where we had to start thinking again about how do we educate our police to do rights-based policing. This is not something that I think can be accomplished through individual accountability. Individual accountability, of course, is very important. But at the same time, we need to have more conversations about systemic change and systemic policing. Because we also know that, like with everything else, we all get educated or we go for experiential training in different countries. And so that also demonstrates that we are all interconnected in the way in which we apply certain standards. And I think for me, the Black Lives Matter and the unfortunate killing and brutal killing of George Floyd hopefully highlighted to all of us that we need to start holding our police accountable throughout the world for the way in which they treat citizens, that the purpose of policing is not to violate the rights of other people. It's to ensure that you have law and order within your society. I live in the Netherlands now, and it's always so fascinating for me because when I see the police engage with citizens, it's very polite. Police are not always armed. There isn't that sense of fear and intimidation if you do get approached by the police. And of course, maybe that would be different for different population groups within the Netherlands. I'm not quite sure. But I do think that it's time for us to start holding the police accountable for how they engage, especially with marginalized communities, because I think it's a reflection on all of us and the kind of humanity that we all possess if we say it's okay for certain groups to be treated in this way, while others are treated with more respect and dignity.
I hear you when you say that police should be aware of how they deal with marginalized communities. I I'm a refugee of civil war, and a lot of refugees are afraid of people in police uniform. It just triggers you, takes you to a place, it takes you to a very fearful place. But talking about police violence in Minnesota, this has been an issue for so long. There have been high profile police killings. One of them happened when you were actually here in Minnesota in 2015. Jamar Clark was shot and killed by a Minneapolis police officer. The police officers who were involved in that shooting were never charged. The state couldn't prove any unlawful action um, by the police. And then in 2017, just 2 years later, another Minneapolis police officer shot and killed a Minneapolis resident, a woman. And then 4 years later, we're in the same position. You know, there's still more Black people being killed by police officers in the streets of America. But now it seems like the conversation has shifted. I remember covering those issues back in 2017 as a city government reporter. And before we were focusing on, are police being disciplined? Are they following the rules? Are they violating the camera policy rules? And now it seems like we're talking about defunding and abolishing the police and just getting rid of them altogether. I wonder how modern policing looks like in South Africa. I'm just curious to know if you can please help us understand how modern policing looks like in South Africa. That would be wonderful.
Well, I mean, I don't think the police in South Africa are not well resourced. And this is again a reflection of inequality. We've privatized a lot of security. So those of us in the middle class and who constitute elite aspects of society, in inverted commas, would often then rely on private security in order to protect yourself from crime. And rather than policing, at least in my view in South Africa, rather than policing being about ensuring that people are protected from crime, from criminal activity, it's also become a site of a lot of contestation and resistance, because the people who are being harassed by the police a lot of the time are people who are accused of violating municipal bylaws. So if you're a street vendor on the side of the road, selling some sweets, or if you're a homeless person sleeping on a bench, you would most likely be harassed by the police. Instead of what we always say, why aren't criminals being, use the resources to go and, capture criminals, etc. And so this, again, what ends up happening is what we've seen is that policing has also become a tool to sustain apartheid spatial planning, right? To ensure that undesirables, or what I would call in inverted commas, undesirable people, are kept out of neighborhoods and environments that the middle class doesn't want to see. And that should not be the purpose of policing. We shouldn't be harassing homeless people who actually do not have access to housing, which is a human right in our constitution, in order to protect wealthy people in their neighborhoods from a fear that is perceived and not necessarily real. It's been exacerbated during COVID. Recently, I saw a very horrible video of local police harassing a woman vendor who was selling sweets and trying to generate a livelihood for herself on the side of the street in an affluent neighborhood. We are also one of the countries that has the highest unemployment and especially youth unemployment. And so if people are trying to make a living and yet they are going to be harassed by the police, even when you're trying to make a living in a country where we have such high unemployment, it becomes more and more violent structurally as we unpeel the layers. So we also have to think about the purpose of policing within a bigger context, not just in terms of the way people are managed or handled, or whether the police is resourced, but also where the police is spending its energy with its limited resources that are available.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So with all this observations, both here in Minnesota and just around the world and policing in South Africa, how has that informed your work as a human rights lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think about my career over the past 15 years in human rights, I think my perceptions have evolved over time. My research looks a lot more now on legal anthropology and legal consciousness, and how people who are supposed to be, who are responsible for implementing laws, how do they understand the rights in the Constitution? And what we find is that, a lot of the time, even if you look at things like complaints to the police for sexual violence, because these issues are seen as domestic issues, patriarchal approaches in policing still find expression in how they operate, right? So how they take a complaint on gender-based violence, how they manage that complaint, whether or not they're going to register the complaint, whether they investigate the complaint. All of these things are also rooted in the kind of patriarchal and colonial society that we come from. So even though we've transitioned in a political sense, the mindsets of people haven't changed. And so what I try to understand in my work is that I don't think it's as clear-cut as just saying, well, replace people or defund. I think it's also about saying what kind of people are we working with and how are we training people to execute their jobs. So yeah, I think just in terms of my work and what I've tried to do is also to try and understand the various layers of how people operate within very authoritarian structures. What are the priorities when people are executing their functions, and particularly the police? If you are going to be kind of monitored for a bonus and you are not well paid, and your payment structure is dependent on how many people you detain, that's obviously going to drive you to detain people, not so much because you want to investigate whether or not people are guilty of the crime that they committed, but also because you want to achieve your targets in order to qualify for a bonus, or in order to qualify for higher pay. So perhaps we also need to start thinking about what does a living wage look like for a policeman? What are the struggles that ordinary policemen have to confront in order to execute or to live their own lives without them feeling compelled to do things simply because they need to sustain a system that also doesn't treat them with dignity. I think that's also a very important point, you know, just as an aside. When we became a democracy, one of the forefathers of our constitution, Justice Albie Sachs, who was very good friends with RBG, may she rest in peace. And what he said was that, you know, ensuring that we transition from apartheid as equals was not only important for victims of apartheid, it was also important for the dignity of the perpetrator, in order for them to restore their dignity, that there was a space for forgiveness. And I think that's something that we need to start thinking about, even within policing. To policemen themselves, what kind of experience do they go through when they are executing these horrible or executing horrible treatment towards ordinary people? I think it also speaks to their lack of humanity in some ways.
Tandy, I don't think people here in the United States, especially Minnesota, can relate to that, but I can. I come from a place of war. And one of the conversation we talk about when it comes to peace building is what kind of resources are we giving to our, you know, law enforcement? What kind of opportunities do they have? Here, the conversation is different. So I hear you when you say that. Looking at that and what's going on here, obviously, I'm not going to ask you to take one side of this whole debate, because where you at and what's going on here is totally, it's a different culture, it's a different issue, even though issues that have happened in South Africa is what's happening here is so similar to it. You know, we can talk about South Africa and it feels like we're talking about Minneapolis, but let's talk about, let's come back to peace building. What does peace building mean to you? When you hear the word peace building, what comes to mind?
Well, I think when I was younger, peace building was just kind of Nelson Mandela and his smiling face and hope that anything was possible, you know. It was really, I think when I was younger, this very, and I wouldn't say naive, I think it was a national belief that all of us wanted to move forward into a warm and, well, not warm, but democratic society, one where everyone would be treated with dignity and respect. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that, you know, I think peace building is also about recognizing and acknowledging the violence that people have endured. It's about reparation for that violence. It's about acknowledging that people through war, it's not only your dignity that is denied in a personal sense, but your hard work your material possession is often destroyed. People would have worked, I mean, my grandfather and my father were victims of forced removals in South Africa. It meant now, well, for me as Thandi in democratic South Africa, the land that they were forcibly removed from is some of the most prime land in Cape Town. And they have not been compensated for those forced removals. It means that you are disrupting, generational or intergenerational wealth creation. You are disrupting the ability for people to hold others accountable for how they have stolen or they have killed other people. And so I do think we need to start having difficult conversations about accountability and about wealth redistribution, because some of us are benefiting in our own current privilege as a result of generations of the oppression of other people and of our neighbors that are right next door to us. And we are not understanding, as you know, in the present moment, how the past is still affecting us now. And that until we actually start acknowledging and finding ways to implement mechanisms of redistribution and material justice, I don't think we're going to be able to move forward towards a society of peace.
I mentioned to you when we were having our conversation the other day, I said, you know, when I hear peace building, my mother comes to my mind. When the war broke, I watched her handle so many difficult things just to keep us peaceful and peace and survive this hardships. And I see her as a source of healing. I wonder, you mentioned Nelson Mandela, and in the United States, a lot of people know who Nelson Mandela is. He's that figure of peace. And my mother being that peaceful person to me, when I hear of the word peace, my mom comes to mind. My religion comes to my mind. Islam means peace. And you can relate to that from your mother's side. And we talked about the paradise being under the feet of mothers. Mothers endure so much. Women endure so much. They bear the brunt of so many horrifying things. The war, conflicts. Women and children are the ones who are dealing with the consequences of those. I wonder if there's a connection between peace and healing. People are looking for that in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the United States, where we're looking for a source of healing. And we have seen, people tapping into their communities to get that, building these sacred places. We've seen the George Floyd Square pop up, which is a memorial site at 38th and Chicago. I wonder if there's a connection between peace building and healing.
I think there's a very clear connection between peace building and healing. I always wonder how it was that my parents' generation were able to withstand apartheid. They were born into it, and they managed to see it come to an end within their lifetime. They also managed to raise children in a free South Africa. And for me, I think what was very important in the way that I was raised, and especially my mother, was always, I think, understanding that the world moves forward. And so the moments that they were going through were moments, and that they needed to prepare their children for a future that they would not be a part of. There's a famous poet from Iranian poet, I think, Khalil Gibran, who says, "Your children are not your children. They may come through you, but they do not belong to you. They belong to the world." And that is something that my mother, I think, really lived by, because she knew that our world would be a different world. And so what she tried to make us understand for all of us was that, firstly, we were raised in community, that notwithstanding any of the success that we may have, we form part of a bigger space and a bigger community. It's your aunties and your grandparents and your uncles, and I think this is very common in African society, that a village raises a child. And in order for that child to flourish, it requires some form of a peaceful environment. And so even though they were in this really complicated space of a violent society, even though my family, many members were incarcerated, detention, tortured, somehow they were still able to create a very peaceful environment for us as the kids. And that, I think, was largely because we were raised within a sense of community. And I think that's common for all of us. The other thing that I think is important is recognizing that what people are struggling for is also just the space to live their lives on their own terms, regardless of what you or I may perceive of what a good life may look like. People should have the agency to decide what they want, what it is that they want to do with their lives. And so for me, a huge part of healing is the space to just be yourself, whether that's to be angry or sad, or even just to enjoy freedom at its most basic level. If we're not going to create the conditions in order for people to enjoy their lives on their own terms, I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve healing through peace building. And so, you know, we can talk about that through, if we're looking at it through the lens of development. Yes, we can look at, you know, Amartya Sen's capabilities approach and what people need in order to live a life with dignity. But I think even more than that, it's about recognizing each individual's worth so that people do have the space to engage with the trauma that conflict and violence would have caused them. But I think if we don't get to a space where we create the conditions for people to engage with processes of healing, that's going to be very difficult, despite the amount of resources that get invested into peace building.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about trauma and healing. You know, the last more than 1 year has been very difficult for all of us, for everyone. You know, we're the privileged ones that have a place to live, a safe home to wake up from. But people have been just wanting to breathe. And we have to recognize that Black people have not been able to breathe for centuries. And the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd and other Black people in this country, and with the unrest that have erupted in this country, people just want to breathe and find that space to be themselves and be with other people. You know, you and I are similar in age. Our experiences are different and similar in a way. You know, your way of coping with trauma might be different from my way of coping with it. But how do we break this cycle of intergenerational trauma? You know, when I hear about trauma and healing, Resma Menachem, a Minnesota native, comes to mind. You know, he's the author of my grandmother's hand. And I would recommend all of you who are listening to this discussion to buy that book and read it. But how do we break this, you know, cycle of trauma?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because something that we know, and one of the books that I would also recommend is, or the author that I would recommend that is a South African that deals a lot with trauma, is Prof. Pumla Gubodo Madikizela, and I can put that in the chat a bit later. But we talk about trauma living in the body, and intergenerational trauma being passed through the body. And something that I think is a responsibility for me is to deal with my trauma in a way that my mother couldn't. And to also engage with multiple ways of how our past has informed our present, and how the personal interacts with the political, and also how the individual interacts with society, and how those two things are in constant communication with each other. And to not be dismissive of the huge impact that these incidents have had on us and how it triggers us in different ways. It was, fascinating for me, and maybe it was, and we spoke about this quite a bit, my father and I, when we were at home after George Floyd's killing, about seeing very prominent people on national TV, particularly Black men, just breaking down in the middle of interviews and crying, and how powerful it was to witness Black men in tears. It's something that I think, especially with, how we are kind of groomed with various gender norms and masculinity in the context of patriarchy, that we don't give space for people to express emotion. And so how do we then ensure that people feel safe enough to say that we're not coping, or that it's just too much to have to wear multiple masks and move through the world in a way just to kind of fit in, or, to speak in a certain way, to look a certain way. All of these things are about how do we become our authentic selves so that we can do good in the world, without feeling that these are things that we have to be pressured into doing, but actually because this is just who we are. And if we can be our authentic selves, then I think we can achieve a lot of amazing things together. But I think part of trauma is not giving yourself the space to be who you are, or not that you're not giving yourself the space, but that society doesn't give the space for you to actually explore those feelings, to honor those feelings, to honor our past and the amount of pain that people experience for us to be free. I think for every brown and Black person, we see it often written in quotes that we walk as 10,000. We don't just come as one. Our ancestors survived various forms of violence, and we're just, I don't know how we managed to get here, but each of us sitting here come as a result of just generations not giving up. And I think it becomes our responsibility as young people to use our freedom responsibly and to engage with processes like therapy, which is another thing, in many of our societies in the global South, we don't like talking about mental health. We don't like talking about vulnerability. And so how do we as young people break that norm, break that chain and make these conversations normal for all of us to talk about mental health, to talk about the fact that we're not coping, our triggers, etc.
Right. You mentioned, trauma living in the body, and our ancestors enduring a lot of violence, a lot of pain, and we're carrying those traumas, right? I wanted to just mention what you said. Yes, trauma does live in the body and mind, but Resma says trauma starts in the body first, not in our heads, because the body is where we live. It's where we fear, hope, and react. It's where we constrict and relax.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I would like to segue to, in our last conversation, you said something that was very powerful, and I think it's just seeing how your mother especially prepared you for this journey of breaking that intergenerational trauma. You mentioned having grown, and this is a quote from you. You said, having grown up in apartheid, where a lot of the education, even at the turn of democracy, wasn't really to affirm women of color, it was to assimilate you into a white structure. And so having parents who also forced me to unlearn and to be a critical thinker and to ask questions is part of the reason why you said you think you have a voice and you're able to break free. Could you elaborate more on that? I thought that was just powerful.
Thank you, Faiza. I mean, I think affirmation is probably one of the most powerful tools you can give to anybody for them to achieve anything. I was born in the 1980s in South Africa, and so it was the turning point from apartheid to democracy. But it was also a lot of violence. And my father always jokes and he says, you know, from the time Thandi was 3, she always just said, no, but why? And that's because my parents engaged with me as an equal, as a human being with dignity, with rights. I was about 5 years old when I had a poster of the Children's Rights Charter on my wall. And so even if I was going through disciplinary with my parents, I knew I could turn to that charter to hold them accountable in how they treated me when they were disciplining me. And so I knew that I had a right to feel safe, that I had a right to a name, that my name mattered. You know, the other thing is that my name is an African name, and I come from a background that is, it's mixed race. In our cultural dynamic is one that is very mixed, and largely a community of Muslim and Christian people. And so the names are often either English or Arabic names. And I was given an African name. And that caused quite a bit of questioning, I suppose, especially from our very traditional Muslim grandmother. She wanted to know, why would you give your child a non-Arabic name? And my father was very clear, you know, I was an African first, and my name would remind me that I'm an African first. Because always people ask me, why is your name Thandi? What does Thandiwe mean? It means the loved one in isiXhosa. And so everything in terms of how I think I was raised, and the names that were chosen for me were to affirm that I belong, and that I belong everywhere, and that I have a right to be wherever I want to be and to be whoever I want to be. At the same time, my parents were also very clear that if you are going to talk, you need to talk responsibly. You need to be educated when you talk. You can say controversial things, but ensure that they are informed by a valid perspective. So you need to read. It's not just about having voice. It's also about educating yourself. And so I feel very lucky in that regard, to have had parents that were very conscious about the kind of life they wanted for me, which I think they were not able to live, even though they would have wanted all of those things for themselves.
Mm-hmm. It just goes to show how history is so important, um, especially to us Africans. You know, we always go back to history to learn, you know, from that, and to also know where we're going. In order for you to know where you're going, you have to kind of know where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And my story is so similar to yours in a way, because I've had, you know, that I've been very lucky to have a family that has cherished me from the beginning. And you said when I was young, you said I didn't I was asking why, and I was so similar. You can kind of see why you're a lawyer and why I'm a journalist. We've asked so many difficult questions, and those experiences kind of help you move through the world. And we have to recognize that we're uh, one of the few privileged ones. And I wasn't privileged enough 5 years ago, but I would consider myself in that camp now, that I'm fortunate enough to have a good paying job, and I have a house, and I feel, you know, I feel like I'm in no harm.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go back to Resma and healing. And we've talked about, in order to heal, you know, the advice he gives us is you kind of have to tap into your community to find that resiliency and recovery, because historical trauma, as we have just talked about, is transferred from one generation to another. And then he, you know, poses this James Baldwin quote. And I love this book so much. I love this book. And we've also talked about Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. But this book, Resma's book, is that book of healing and breaking free from historical trauma. You know, he quotes James Baldwin, which, you know, his quote is, history is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. Um, and we've talked about people forgetting their history. and just saying that was the past, let's just move on. How can we move on from the past, because what has existed in the past is still causing more problems for us and for many people. Let's talk to me about your frustration with people forgetting their history, and how important is that in the healing process?
Yeah, I mean, I think often, the people who tell us to move on are the ones who are uncomfortable with the conversation. It's a very interesting thing, because often in the South African context, you hear young white people saying, well, it's been 26 years, the government could have done more, they're failing. Or, it's not, I didn't choose apartheid, it wasn't something that I chose. These are not things that any of us chose, yet at the same time, even though within my family, a few of us are successful in any given term, the majority of people in my community do not have access to basic services. And that's because, I think, because young white people, and in the South African context still, we are such a segregated society economically, which is informed by our racial past, that you still find that people are not even able to conceptualize what poor neighborhoods look like, what the experiences are of people who are poor. And we have to recognize that if we're not going to be able to have they shouldn't actually be difficult conversations. They should just be conversations that allow us to understand where it is that we come from, what were the policies that supported this evil regime, how are those policies different or similar to present policies, and where do we go forward in order to make a change so that we can all work together to create a society that we all want to be part of. I think often when we talk about, well, let's just forget about it, it's a very egotistical approach to have. It kind of centers the self, and it makes it more about this very emotional conversation that I don't think is a relevant conversation. We should be talking about what kind of society do we want to have for ourselves and for our children going forward. If we continue in this way, our children are going to be living in the same kind of society, if not more violent. And why? We've got young people telling us that they don't want to be part of the same practices towards our environment, for example. They're holding older generations accountable for the way in which we've destroyed the environment. They're living a completely different life, and yet at the same time, we want to say, let's just forget. So if we don't find a way to say, how do we ensure that we recognize the past, that we hold each other accountable, and that we also are proactive in implementing change as a collective. And that's going to be messy, and it's okay. I think also people get very nervous when conversations get a bit messy, or when it becomes contentious, because maybe it's easier to be conflict avoidant. But the messy conversation actually leads us to a process of being able to express our vulnerability, to being able to then understanding what it is that we actually want to change, to creating collective strategies, to have different lists of priorities about where we want to target that change. But we all then are able to buy into the process because we've all been able to express some form of vulnerability and, I think, connection with the actual issue that we're dealing with, instead of running away from it, which I think a lot of people try to do.
I feel very fortunate to be, part of the Humphrey School. I graduated recently from the MPA program, and this was, I started the cohort before George Floyd, before the pandemic, and we were having so much difficult conversations. Sometimes it was unbearable for some people, but we continued to have those conversations, and out of those conversations and conflicts, you know we had lasting relationships out of those, and that's the beauty. A lot of institutions don't really prepare you, and I'm not just saying this. You look at the way the cohorts are set up, and the way things are done at the Humphrey School, and we're having conversations. Things are happening now and are about to happen, and I think myself and many of my white friends who were in that program should say that they're very lucky because it has prepared us for this specific moment that we're in. I understand we have a few minutes left before we
Yeah.
wrap up. You know, we've talked about some of the pain, the trauma, the violence. Let's, you know, healing. Let's talk about hope. You know, I've been very hopeful, and I continue to be very hopeful. I must say that I've been hopeless one time since I've been in the United States I've been here since 2004. And there was only one time I've been very hopeless. And that was when we put in, you know, office a president who divided all of us, who didn't care about journalism, freedom of speech, who exposed us, immigrants, reporters, to a lot of violence, and we're still paying, you know, we're still dealing with some of those. But I'm now hopeful. And what makes me very hopeful is seeing yourself and many others in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, around the world, who are standing up and pushing forward and saying, we're not going to watch this anymore. You know, we don't see that deafening white silence anymore. Our white allies are stepping up and shielding us, like you've said, from harm. What gives you hope?
I think young people, you know, I think it's important. I've tried very hard to ensure that I remain in touch with different generations. You know, my niece, I've got a 6-year-old and 4-year-old niece and nephew, but also I teach students. And you realize that, you know, sometimes, especially when you're doing human rights work, it can be very doom and gloom because you're confronted by structural violence all the time. But we forget that the movements for environmental justice, for example, are youth-led movements. The abolition of guns in schools has been a youth-led movement in the US. Young people are extremely brave and are very positive also about the future. They've got a lot more, I think, courage to speak about things that their parents probably wouldn't have spoken about, or even just one generation before them wouldn't. So yeah, I turn to the young people because I think, like every generation, we always moving forward. But yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's our conversation. It was so nice talking to you, Thandi.
Yeah.
I hear everything you said, and I'm so happy that we have people doing this important work, having these difficult conversations. I think Mary wants to ask.
Yeah, we have thanks. We have, I don't want to ask a question, but we have a couple of people in the last 10 minutes who would like to. I see that Catherine Squires, our associate dean, has, and who was really very instrumental in pulling together the conceptualization of this symposium, has a couple of comments. And then I also noticed that Patrice Kunesh, who herself is a lawyer, a Native American lawyer working with the Native American Rights Fund, had a question, and maybe she could ask after Catherine.
Just really quickly, I want to just thank you all for weaving together so many layers of what it means to think from the abstract level of the law down to the very, very basic level of, do people have a place to sleep? It was beautiful hearing your conversation and seeing all the connections between places across the Atlantic and here up at the Great Lakes. I just had one follow-on. I wrote this down, I tweeted it. Faiza, that phrase that you gave us, paradise is under the feet of our mothers. I almost burst into tears when I heard that. I'm doing it right now. But I just wanted each of you to maybe give us a reflection on that for a moment. If we centered that in how we thought about things like the vulnerability needed to be in actual dialogue with each other about these hard historical and contemporary violences that people have experienced, to heal intergenerational trauma. What does it mean to you to imagine how paradise is under the feet of our mothers as a paradigm for thinking about peace building?
I can go first, Tandy, unless you wanna. You know, that's when the prophet, peace be upon him, was asked, you know, how do I enter paradise? And he didn't struggle with the answer. He said, you know, paradise lies under the feet of your mother. If you, you know, treat your mother with respect and with dignity, then, you know, paradise, you are gonna go to paradise. And I think a lot of us Muslims live up to that. We, you know, we value our mothers. And when it comes to mothers are peace, right? A lot of, you know, not all of us are, I understand, not all of us are fortunate enough to have mothers, but we have, you know, a loved one who we regard as a mother. And I think if we treat everyone as our own mother, and cherish them and love them, I think that's where you find your peace. That's where you get your paradise. What do you think, Tandy?
Well, I think also, you know, the statement for me is very powerful as I get older, more so because what I'm learning is that mothers are also the carriers of our history and our culture. You know, and also of our freedom. Mothers in all of our communities have been responsible not only for ensuring that we are nurtured and protected, but also ensuring that we are able to move forward in the world as survivors. And so I think as a paradigm, you know, using that phrase, beyond just the respect for mothers, I think if we are able to understand that that mothers are the carriers of future generations and therefore the builders of society, then I think we can also start having conversations about history and heritage. And, you know, there's so much also in African culture where not everything in our history has been documented. It's through the narratives of our mothers that we are able to know our histories and our ancestry, etc. And it's only very recently, I mean, in the South African context more so, that women are starting to write down history more. Because if we don't do it, then obviously history is going to be told through the lens of men, as has always been the case. And so I do think from that perspective, if we are able to document and take that responsibility quite seriously, because we see ourselves as carriers of history for future generations, I think it can be a powerful tool for transformation.
And in the African culture, right, we kind of use the symbol as African mothers are like going into a lioness den. You know, you go into a den and you have the male lion and the female lion, and the female lion is the one that you don't want to mess with, right? And in the African culture, you know, women and mothers are the ones, they're the ones that are holding things together. They're those peace builders. When there was so much conflict, it was the women who were saying, you know, what can we do to bring peace? And it's that peace, it's that, you know, statement from the prophet that says, your paradise lies under the feet of your mother. You want to go to paradise, then you have it. If your mother is present, it's under her feet.
Great. Let's see, we have another question. Patrice, would you like to ask your question live, or otherwise I can read it? There you go.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My mother's family is Native American from the Standing Rock reservations in the Dakotas. And you may have heard recently about the uncovering of graves, the discovery of mass graves of children at boarding schools throughout Canada, but also here in the United States. and my family also has been tremendously impacted by these boarding school atrocities. So in our family, and I love this conversation about mothers and such, they are the ones that have been scarred, and the carriers of the future generations carry these scars and carry these this violence and this hopelessness, as we talked about earlier. So we talk about a little bit of how we handle this intergenerational trauma, the epigenetics. And in our culture, there's a lot of traditions, there's a lot of ceremony. And as much as we work through the language, the culture, the history, the documenting of this trauma, the real lived experience in terms of socioeconomic, disparities and violence all around us, it doesn't feel like it's enough of a protective solution. I mean, there's got to be some readjustment, and I think Thandi, you had talked about a wealth distribution, and someone else talked about reparations. So could you both kind of talk about the documentation, as you mentioned, but also the strength, and maybe it's just you just have to kind of go like this. Sometimes it is culture and tradition. Maybe it is the socioeconomic readjustment. But I really, really appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice. And I'll let Thandi and Faiza and/or respond.
Yeah, Patrice, thank you so much for the question. And I think it's you spot on, right? I think it is a bit of both. It's the traditions and the healing that's important. The South African Constitution, there are a lot of academics at the moment who are quite critical of the Constitution because it doesn't mention the word apartheid. And so in terms of how we know how far back to implement reparations, for example, is something that is still heavily debated. A lot of the reparations that were awarded during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission haven't really been paid out to victims because of the language within the framing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Who was considered a victim was very narrow. And so in kind of a legal sense, there were very few victims of apartheid, if we're just going to look at it through that very strict definition. And so we are now at a point where we need to think, how do we deal with inequality and systemic injustice in a manner that actually brings together or brings forms of social justice so that people can benefit from all the fruits of democracy. And so I think I think you need to have kind of a very dynamic conversation. On the one hand, it is about the material redistribution, but I agree at the same time, it's also about ensuring that there are processes of healing, that the things that we kind of neglect for political processes kind of fall by the wayside. And we also see in South Africa that there's kind of been, because we're implementing more and more austerity measures, the amount of resources that are being put into things like arts and culture has become very limited now. And we forget that, arts and culture is such an important part of forming part of your society. There's so many things that fall outside of just the material redistribution that is required in order for us to feel that we belong in our society. So I just want to say to Patrice that I do agree with her proposition that we kind of need to have a bit of both, constantly working in tandem with each other in order to achieve healing and social justice. Thank you.
And I will just add, I don't think that we can solve these issues with just policies and formal trainings. I think we should start focusing on healing communities and giving them the equitable resources that they need and they have been demanding. There's this whole notion, in my career, oh, you're giving a voice to the voiceless. And that's I was telling Tandy, that's a phrase that I've used, you know, in the past, and I'm saying I'm not going to use it anymore, because as I grow up, I see that we haven't been voiceless. Been demanding we've been demanding these resources for so long. We've been talking about these violences for so long, and I think we can't just answer these um, hard questions with developing things or bringing back businesses to normal. I think we must start with healing communities and just distributing resources equitably.
I'd like to ask Faiza and Thandi, do you have a few more minutes to stay on? I know that just a few. Okay, great. Let's see. I saw a question from, and our questions come from so many different places. I saw a question from Kim Cham, who says is a young Cambodian person, and wondering, how do we reconcile with wanting to be our young, authentic selves while coming from a very collectivist community? Kim, would you like to ask that live, or shall I just read? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question, but the basic question was about this tension between and I will just go ahead and read it. The tension between the authentic selves coming from a collectivist community, and a community, also the Cambodian community went through a huge trauma of genocide, but where mental health or emotions are not talked about that. And you referred to that just a little bit, I think, a while back, Thandi. Could you just talk, both of you sort of referred to those issues of trauma. Your thoughts on that, on those issues?
Yeah, Mary, in South Africa, in Southern Africa, there's a saying, we live by the principle of Ubuntu. I am because of others. In many societies in sub-Saharan Africa, this term is quite prominent. We cannot be our individual selves without our community. And so the two are not independent, the two are dependent on each other. And I think, what I've come to realize is that if we do live along principles of Ubuntu, there is enough space for you to be your individual self while still finding space within community to carry you as your individual self. We see this a lot in the South African context, if we speak about LGBT rights, for example, right? A lot of, there's kind of the mainstream view that a lot of global South societies are discriminatory or anti-LGBT. But actually what you find when you read the history is that notions of, gender fluidity, etc., have been very long-standing practices or lived realities within our societies for many generations. And so I think we also need to start maybe exploring how we perceive our own communities, right? Those of us that move between different worlds of societies, moving between South and North and East and West, different layers of class privilege, etc. We also need to start thinking about how do we relate to our own communities and how do we ensure that we are able to make a contribution within our communities while at the same time remaining true to ourselves. And I do think it's possible. It does come with a lot of contestation, intergenerational contestation, but I think that's the whole point of society and evolution, is that we move forward through contestation. But I don't think we need to make a choice between the individual self and the collective community. Faiza, what do you think?
I think there are two types of traumas, right? One that has we didn't choose, and then one that comes that we're exposed to in our society, and it depends on the individual how they want to deal with it. I think for us Africans, Thandi, is that we have that pain that came from colonialism, the apartheid, right, the genocide, the conflicts, and then we have our own kind of pain and trauma from society that we're exposed to, maybe at the professional level as well. As a human rights lawyer and as a journalist, we're often are the first ones who are exposed to a lot of traumas. We're talking to people who are grieving. We're the first people to be at a crime scene. So we're dealing with a lot of traumas from different angles. And what helps me the most is finding that community, being a part of a group where I can, find that recovery. Heal my body. But every person is different. My view of healing and the way I go about it might be different for anybody else.
So I will have our very last question, and I feel like we could go for a really long time with this fantastic conversation. Calvin has asked a question specifically about reparations, and wondering, and this is for Thandi, if you could speak about reparations, maybe, and we're starting to see this in the United States, some localities are trying to address the issue of reparations, since we're so far not getting any traction on a national level. I wonder if you've been following that and if you have any comments on that.
I haven't been following it closely within, the specific localities, but it is a conversation that happens quite often, particularly at the United Nations level, about reparations for slavery, for example. And we've just seen now Germany taking responsibility for the genocide that happened in Namibia. And this is a very huge step that has been made. I've gone through very different views about reparations, because on the one hand, if we are going to reduce violent experiences, dispossession, to just something that's material, and then say, well, we've now paid for it, and therefore you should just move forward. I don't know if we'll end up having a structural conversation about the implications of those various acts and how they kind of continue today. But at the same time, reparations are important to acknowledge what happened. And so I think, it's kind of a very contested conversation. And I think it's one where you do need the acknowledgement. But I think what we may need to start talking about is who gets to decide what the reparation should look like. Perhaps we should be turning to young people to ask them what it is that they need in the form of reparation, rather than only kind of this conversation being dominated largely by older generations. Because I think the younger generation may have a completely different view of what's needed now. And perhaps their voice needs to be amplified more.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to thank very much Faiza and Thandi for this fascinating conversation, and for really stretching the conversation about peace building into so many domains, from the constitutional problems, the questions about policing, cultural traditions, the sense of healing and trauma. What was covered here and in the really sort of active chat that was going on, that was very difficult even to keep up with, was really the kind of conversation to bring your knowledge and experience of the issues right here today in Minneapolis to your global experience and expertise. And so I would like to thank both of you so much for being with us here today, and hopefully one day we will have you, Thandi, back in Minneapolis and in person to continue this conversation. We are starting at 10:30, 2 separate workshops that you will be able to see if you have signed up for the UR Action workshop or for the Marnita's Table workshop. Thandi and Faiza, if you are interested, you're certainly welcome to stay on. I know it's getting to be late in The Hague where you are. but we really, really appreciate the depth of the thought and the preparation and the knowledge that you brought to us today. So thank you very much for that. And we have a short break. Yeah, thank you. Do you want to say, yeah, I'll give you a second to say a final word if you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for having me and for this really important conversation. I don't think we have enough conversations about how the global affects the local.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just wanted to say thank you to Faiza for leading this conversation and for being in conversation with me. I've learned a lot from you also. So thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.